Hi everyone. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about performing initial load in Oracle Golden Gate. By the end of this lecture, you should be able to understand what is initial load, specify the options to implement the initial load, list the Oracle Golden Gate initial load methods, and understand the difference between each other. This is just a reminder of our roadmap to configure Golden Gate. This lecture covers the second phase, that is perform initial load. Initial load is used to prepare the target tables for synchronization. An initial load takes a copy of the entire source tables and applies it to the target tables so that the movement of transaction data begins from a synchronized state. This is basically what all replication projects start with. You make a copy of the source data to the target database and start the change synchronization from there. Another name for this process is instantiation. Initial load process can be done outside of the Oracle Golden Gate. You can use a database utility to make a copy of your source data into the target database. Most RDBMS systems have a variety of options to make copy among their databases. For example, in Oracle database, you have RMAN cloning, SQL loader, data pump, transportable table spaces, and even the SQL language can be used to copy your data. Using those utilities is beyond the scope of this course. Oracle Golden Gate provides its own methods to perform the initial load. The main advantage of the Golden Gate methods is that some of them support transferring the data among the heterogeneous databases. You are free to use any of the methods that suits your case. Generally speaking, database utilities are most efficient than Oracle Golden Gate initial load methods. And Golden Gate methods, on the other hand, work well with databases that are from different vendors. Here I'm talking about the biggest challenge you may face when you implement the initial load. Suppose you started the initial load and it took 1 hour to finish. After the initial load, you will start the Oracle Golden Gate synchronization to keep the target database in sync with the source database. Now, the challenge is that you need to start the synchronization exactly after the timestamp of the instantiated dataset image. If you start the synchronization at an arbitrary time, the synchronization may try to apply records that are already there. Or if you start it after the initial load was started, the synchronization may miss some operations and this would lead to some data loss. Those possible issues are called conflicts. So how can you handle this problem? How can you start the synchronization exactly after the timestamp of the dataset that you copied in the target database? You have more than one approach to handle this problem. One simple possible approach is simply disable the update on the source database during the initial load. After you finish the initial load, you allow the update again in the database and start the synchronization. This approach is safe and easy, but in some cases it is not possible. Some critical mission applications don't allow you to stop the changes on the production database for a long time. Another approach is to make the copy of the replicated dataset at a specific CSN point. After the initial load finishes, you start the synchronization exactly after that CSN number. This approach is also safe because no conflict will take place. We will follow this approach in the practice lecture. If you are in a scenario where you cannot implement any of those safe approaches, you can follow a third approach. With this one, you start the extract process of the change synchronization configuration, and after that, you start the initial load as well. But you don't start the replicate. The replicate process is configured in a way to ignore the conflicts. After the initial load finishes, you start the replicate and keep monitoring it. After some time of operations, the conflicts will disappear, and you can disable ignoring the conflicts in the replication process. This approach is documented well in the documentation Administering Oracle Golden Gate for Windows and Unix 12c, section 16.2, Loading Data with a Database Utility. This approach worked well in many cases, but it could lead to synchronization problems. Golden Gate initial load methods work well across heterogeneous databases, and that's perhaps the main reason why you may consider using it. While the initial load is going on, the extract reads directly from the source tables without locking the tables. Oracle Golden Gate provides 4 methods to perform the initial load, and you will select the one that is most suitable for your case. If your target objects already have data, Golden Gate Change Delivery can handle the collisions during the initial load. You can configure the Golden Gate to run multiple pairs of extract replicate processes during the initial load to enhance the initial load throughput. The main disadvantage of using Oracle Golden Gate for initial load is its performance. Therefore, for very large databases, if you plan to use the Golden Gate to perform the initial load, you should consider the size of the source tables, the distance and the network bandwidth between the databases, and the disk space required to save the transactions in the trail files. I will describe here the conditions that should apply before you use any of the Golden Gate initial load methods. First, if you have the change synchronization extract and replicate processes already configured, you must disable the DDL extraction and replication by those processes. I will cover the DDL processing in Golden Gate later in this course. Second, it is advisable to perform some actions on the target tables. If your source tables are in an Oracle database and have an unused columns, drop them before you proceed with Golden Gate initial load. It is also recommended to disable the foreign key and check constraints and the triggers. Foreign key constraints can cause errors, and check constraints can slow down the loading process. You can reactivate those constraints after the initial load is successfully finished. It is not a bad idea to remove the indexes in the target tables. The indexes will unnecessarily slow down the load process, and they can be built after the load is finished. Also, you must configure the manager process, and that's why we configure it in the environment preparation step. If your source tables have definitions different from the target tables, and you are using Oracle Golden Gate prior to version 12.2, you must create the data definitions file. You learned how to do that in an earlier lecture. Finally, you're advised to create change synchronization groups before you start the initial load. Please be aware here that we are saying create the groups, but that doesn't mean start them. You start them after the initial load is started. When you use the Oracle Golden Gate initial load, you have to start the processes in the order as shown in the slide. First, you start the change synchronization extract, then you start the initial load extract. Wait for the initial load to finish before you start the change synchronization replicate. Oracle Golden Gate provides 4 methods to perform the initial load. They are direct load, file to replicate, file to database utility, and direct bulk load. I will cover those methods in the incoming slides. To understand the Golden Gate initial load methods, you should know the formats on which the extract trail could be generated. Canonical format is the default trail format that extract generates. This is the format that replicate process understands, and this is the one that it uses for the normal change synchronization process. Format ASCII, format SQL, and format XML, they are all used when you want to load the data using interfaces other than the traditional replicate process. You will learn in this lecture when each of them is used. The logical change records, or LCRs, is used by the integrated replicate process. I will cover the integrated replicate process in a separate lecture. To perform the initial load with the Oracle Golden Gate direct load, you configure an initial load extract process. The process reads from the source records and sends them directly to the replicate task. We call this entity a replicate task and not a replicate process because it is started dynamically by the manager process and it does not require the use of a collector process. To practically use this method, when you add the extract process, you use the source is table option. This option instructs the extract to read the source tables directly rather than from the transaction log. Actually, this option is what makes the difference between adding a primary extract and an initial load extract. Therefore, you will use this option in all Golden Gate initial load methods. In the extract parameter file, you must include the RMT task parameter. RMT task parameter instructs the manager process on the target system to start a replicate as a one-time task with a group name specified in the group clause. On the target system, you use the special run option when you issue the add replicate command. This option identifies the initial load replicate as a one-time run, not a continuous process. As I explained in the previous slide, when you use the direct load for initial load, the data is sent directly from the extract to the replicate task. This method allows you to perform data transformation in the extract side, the replicate side, or both of them. This method delivers the data in large blocks and directly uses the database engine. That's why it is considered as a fast method. It also does not require intermediate trail for its processing. On the negative side, this method doesn't support LOBs, long, UDT, and XML data types. It doesn't support encryption, and it has constraints on compressed tables. In general, this method sounds good for small tables with no non-supported data types. By the way, the documentation Oracle Fusion Middleware administering Oracle Golden Gate for Windows and Unix 12c product number E6635705, page 16-18, it claims that PLOBs, UDT, and XML are supported by direct load. I think this is a typo. They are not supported. Another available Golden Gate initial load method is the file to replicate method. With this method, the initial load extract extracts the source records from the source tables and write them to the extract files in canonical format. In the target side, the initial load replicate loads the data from the files and apply the records using the database interface. The rows are applied one record at a time. That's why this method is considered the least efficient in the initial load methods. To configure this method, add the source is table parameter in the parameter file. It should be the first parameter in the file. This parameter instructs the extract to read the source tables directly rather than from the transaction log. To format the output for processing by replicate, use the RMT trail parameter or RMT file parameter. Notice that you use source is table parameter for this method, but you use source is table option of the add extract in the direct load method. You cannot use the source is table parameter for the direct load method. This initial load method allows you to make data transformation in the extract side as well as in the replicate side. The most advantage of this method is that it supports the extraction of long and LOP data. On the other side, it is the least efficient method. The third initial load option in Oracle Golden Gate is called File to Database Utility. With this method, the initial load extract process writes to extract files in plain text ASCII format. This file will be read by a database utility like SQL Loader for an Oracle database, Microsoft BSCP, DTS, or SQL Server Integration Services, SSIS utilities for SQL Server, or IBM Load Utility, Load UTIL for DB2 database. As part of the load procedure, Oracle Golden Gate uses the initial load replicate to create, run, and control files required by the database utility. To configure this method, use the RMT file or RMT trail parameter and format ASCII with appropriate options, such as BCP or SQL Loader. With the file to database utility method, transformation can be set in the extract side only. This method is considered to be an efficient method because of the tight integration between the utility and its database. On the other hand, this method doesn't support replicating non-ASCII data. Moreover, any limitation presented by the utility is also a limitation for this method. Your fourth option for Golden Gate initial load is the direct bulk load. In this method, the initial load extract sends the data directly to an initial load replicate task, which is started dynamically by the manager process. The initial load replicate task interfaces with the API of SQL Loader utility to load the data as a direct path bulk load into the target database. The direct bulk load provides the best performance among the initial load methods, but it is only supported in Oracle databases. The configuration you make to use this method is similar to the one you use to configure direct load method. The difference is that you add the parameter bulk load to the replicate parameter file. This initial load method allows you to configure the transformation in both the extract and the replicate side. As I said, this method is considered as the fastest golden initial load method. Unfortunately, it works only with Oracle databases, and it doesn't support LOBs or long data types. Besides selecting the right method for initial load, you can follow the following tips for improving the performance of an initial load for large databases. Create a set of initial load extracts and initial load replicates, and let them run in parallel so that each pair takes care of loading subset of your data. Another idea to enhance the initial load performance is to use the TCP buffer size option in the RMT host parameter. So in this lecture, you learned about the initial load methods that Oracle Golden Gate provides and knew the differences among each other. you're going to be introduced with a couple of those methods in the next practice lecture. Thank you for staying with me. See you in the next lecture.